First of all, thank you very much, everybody, for coming. And I want to welcome our Zoom attendees as well. I hope you got a bowl of popcorn and are in your pajamas. I wish I was. I have been teaching here at Rock Valley College for 13 years, and I teach mostly biology classes. While my PhD research is in environmental science, I studied semi-trucks and alternative fuels. My passion and my hobbies have been with ecology. So I've been backpacking at the Isle Royale 5 times. My most recent time was earlier this year in May with the Project Moose Watch group. Now, if you're not familiar with the Isle Royale Park, it is an island here in the middle of Lake Superior. So the Isle Royale Island is 45 miles long. At its widest point, it is 9 miles wide. I want you to keep this image in mind as we look at this next image. So the geology of the Isle Royale is very interesting. It is made up of volcanic and sedimentary rock. And what I really love about this picture is we can see that the geology at the Isle Royale is very similar to the geology in the Keweenaw Peninsula of the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. And it even shares some of those characteristics with Thunder Bay over in Canada. Now keep this image in mind and keep those oscillating dark and light lines in mind, because those oscillating dark and light lines give us the ridges on the Isle Royale. So this is a topographic map of the island, and hopefully you can really see those rugged ridges of the island. The red lines are the common trails on the island. So let's talk a little bit more about the island. Here we see the island in Lake Superior, and we see the ice bridge starting to form. The ice bridge periodically will form between the island and Canada, and occasionally animals will cross that ice bridge. We'll talk about this ice bridge a little bit more. So now that we have a brief overview of the geology of the island, let's start to zoom in. When we look at the island, we have this undulating vegetation. This picture is taken from the Greenstone Ridge, one of the higher points on the island. If you look off in the distance, you can barely see the edge of Canada. And what I love about seeing that undulating vegetation is we could start to get a feel for the forested regions. The forests are primarily made up of balsam fir, aspen, and birch. When we get into the understory, we have things like thimbleberries and bearberries. One of the things about the Isle is that the vegetation changes very dramatically, very quickly. So if you're starting to get bored with what you're seeing, just hike a little bit more, and trust me, everything is going to change. It is a very, very dramatic biome. This is the boreal biome. I had to pause there because I have a bad habit of calling it the boreal. It needs to be called the boreal biome. Some of the things about a boreal biome is you get this unusual amount of diversity. So in the upper left-hand corner, we see some of the common orchids, and there's so many orchids that grow at the Isle. These are the calypso orchids, and they're nestled in amongst the mosses. In the right-hand corner, we have nodding trillium. There's lots and lots of soggy places, and so down here we have skunk cabbage that's starting to bloom. When you're walking around the Isle, you have to keep your eyes peeled, because you get these wonderful little, just these wonderful little glimpses. Here we have the coral root orchid, and it's one of the rarer orchids to see. So you really have to keep your eyes peeled when you're walking around to catch all of the diversity in the plants. And then the lichen. There are so many lichen at the Isle Royale. This is the largest diversity of lichen outside of Alaska. And so the lichen is just stunning. There's so many in this picture. I'm only going to highlight 3. In the upper left-hand corner, we have gray reindeer lichen. In the middle, we have some Easter foam. And on the right-hand side, we have green reindeer lichen. Now, many of you already know, I really love lichen. Here in the upper left-hand corner is a pelt lichen nestled in amongst the mosses. On the right-hand side is lungwort, and this is a favorite of moose. There's a favorite patch of mine that I love to see at the Isle Royale. I was really bummed the last time I was hiking up there because the moose had consumed so much of it. It really is amazing that lungwort lichen can be big and really elaborate. In the Bottom corner, we have map lichen. Map lichen grows exceptionally slow. I want to give you a sense of how slowly the map lichen grows. I want you to hold out your first finger and take a look at the width of the first finger. If you were to find a map lichen that was that wide, it would be about 100 to 150 years old. Now, it's not unusual at the Isle to find map lichen that are as big as your hand. And while they're not as dramatic as redwood trees, they are easily thousands of years old. So I love going to the Isle and studying the lichen. It's really quite a treat to see that diversity. At the Isle, of course, there's more than just plants and lichen. There's lots of wonderful wildlife. In the spring, a lot of the birds start migrating back and they will be nesting and breeding in the Isle Royale. And this is one of my favorites. This is the white-throated sparrow. I'd like to give you a feel for what it sounds like when these birds return. Now, as melodic as that sound is, imagine that going from before dawn, which is about 4 to 5 o'clock in the morning in May, till well after dark, 9 or 10 o'clock at night, consistently and persistently. That beautiful trilling noise. I do love it, but I can see where it starts to get to you by about the third day of backpacking. Another bird that we see at the Isle Royale is the gray jay. Now the gray jay gives a little bit quieter chattering. I'm going to hit the next arrow and see if it will play on its own. So during the day, you can hear the gray jay chattering to you. One of the things I found interesting this May for Project Moose Watch is we were asked to keep our observations and count our observations of gray jays because they suspect that the population of this bird is declining at the island. Now, one of the other iconic birds that we see at the island are the loons. Several breeding pairs return to the island every year. There's a whole group of researchers that have been studying the loons for years as well. And so all night long, you can hear that melodic call of the loon. So now you've got a sense of what the island is starting to feel and sound like. Let's talk a little bit about the mammals. Here we see a picture of the Arctic hare. This Arctic hare is just starting to lose some of its winter coloration. Now, one of the things that you will not find at the Isle Royale is you will not find any bear and you will not find any raccoons. This is one of the reasons why I love to go back to the island, is because I don't have to encounter either of those kind of pesky animals. The Arctic hare is the snack of wolves. Another snack for wolves will be the beaver. If you're not familiar with beaver, beaver are severe ecosystem engineers. I want to give you a sense of what I mean when I say severe ecosystem engineers. This is one of the beaver dams. It's about 8 foot tall. It's been around for many, many years. I want to draw your attention to all of the water in the background that's being held back by this dam. Think about how that water alters the plants that would be available, and then how the plants alter the animal availability and how all the organisms are going to be using this landscape. There are lots and lots of beaver at the Isle Royale, and they are always making changes and altering the landscape, altering how the water flows. Now, think for a minute if the beaver were gone and that dam was not being maintained, and suddenly you have that flow of water, how everything in the ecosystem would shift and change again. So now you've got a feel for what the island looks like, sounds like, some of the living things that are there. Let's start to focus in on the long-term research of the Isle Royale. Researchers have been studying the wolves and the moose at the Isle since 1958. Here we see in this picture, Rolf Peterson and his wife, Carolyn Peterson. They took over the research from the original researchers in the 1970s. They're still continuing the research project today. And we can see some of the next generation of researchers, Dr. Sarah Hoy and Dr. John Vucicek. Sorry, his name's a little bit challenging to pronounce. So we see this long-term consistency in the researchers, studying the predator and prey relationships and studying the ecosystem response on the island. There is also long-term consistency in the volunteers. Many of the volunteers that come back for Project Moose Watch have been coming back for many years. So we have this beautiful long data set and we have consistency in the researchers and the work happening at the Isle Royale. So now let's talk about the moose. That's what we're all here for, right? So moose are wonderful and awkward organisms. I didn't used to feel this way. I didn't really used to like moose. But the more that I've been learning about moose, the more I find that I'm falling in love with them. Moose are often called bark strippers by the Algonquin. If you're not familiar with moose, they're big. A female can get on average about 800 pounds, while a male can get to be about 1,000 pounds. I would like to, in this video, play a couple of audio, because you may not have heard a female moose. Down towards the bottom is a little kind of hidden. Yep, the higher one, yep. So here's a female moose. They aren't very loud, even when you hear them. That they typically only make that noise when they're talking to their calves. The males, on the other hand, can be a little bit louder. I wanted to play both of these sounds for you because I rarely hear moose. I rarely hear them walking through the woods, and I almost never hear them making that sound. I have yet to hear a male moose in the wild, for example. So the moose are weird and they are awkward. They can live about 8 to 20 years. Part of what makes them look weird and awkward is that long proboscis, their long kind of cartilaginous nose structure. What's amazing about those noses is they can snap the nostrils shut. When they snap the nostrils shut, they can swim, and they can often swim for long distances. It's not unusual for a moose to cross that 13 miles into Canada, or from moose from Canada to cross the 13 miles over to the Isle Royale. Moose are fantastic swimmers, and it doesn't look like they should be wonderful swimmers, especially when you think about the bulk of their body. But we'll talk a little bit later when we're looking in at the legs as to why they might be really good swimmers. Despite the fact that they're good swimmers, their eyesight is terrible, is awful, awful, awful. Moose are going to be chewing and chowing on shrubs and saplings, and they'll be eating any aquatic plants if they're available. But one of the things that moose will be lacking in their diet or in constant need of is sodium. If we lived in Canada right now, we would start to get messages from the Canadian wildlife managers saying, please don't let the moose lick your car. Moose come up and lick people's cars, and they're after the road salt. They're after that sodium. Now, of course, when the moose are coming up and licking the cars, this habituates the moose, and we don't want that because that puts them at risk of getting hit by vehicles. So sodium, definitely a nutrient that moose are needing on a regular basis. Moose, like cows, have a 4-chambered stomach. So this means that they have to do a lot of chewing and rechewing and rechewing. They spend about 8 hours a day chewing their cud. And I don't know about you, but rechewing my food never sounds like a delicious or wonderful thing. So, given that the moose are a prey species, and they have to eat and re-eat their food, and they have bad eyesight, I can understand why moose are a little bit cranky. Moose are notorious for lacking a sense of humor. When I'm hiking up at the Isle Royale, I fear the moose far more than I fear the wolves or even the humans. When the moose decide to run at you, that is a lot of mass. And remembering that they can't see well, they're just going to plow right through you. And this especially is a danger when the cows have their calves. Cows have calves in May. They generally only have about 1 cow. A baby cow, after a couple of years hanging out with its mom, will leave and can mate on its own. The males are going to grow their antlers starting in spring, and then they will shed their antlers after the breeding season. Rutting season in September is another time when the moose are super cranky and you don't want to be around. Now, I want to be clear, moose don't want to fight. Male moose are going to try to avoid a fight. One of the things you may see is you may see male moose start to stand next to each other, shove a little bit, they're sizing each other up. And essentially they're hoping, please, somebody just duck out. I don't really want to do this. It gets really problematic when you have two moose that are a similar size, as we're going to see in this next video. This is a video from Alaska. And it really gives us a sense of why the moose don't want to fight.
Watch out, get back. Get back. Up here would be good. Stay up here. You're okay. This is cool. Stay where you're at.
Extension cord.
Can I go closer?
No. You're fighting and they're going to start running. Do not go closer. Stay up here on this ledge. We're okay. Move over here. Yep, he won.
So those moose were very
battle.
similar in size. So they had to tussle, they had to fight. Hopefully you saw how dangerous that was. Hopefully you saw those skinny little legs and you felt the nervousness I feel every time I see that video. Please don't break a leg, please don't break a leg. Hopefully you saw the stuff intertwined in the one moose's antlers. Fighting and this kind of behavior is very, very risky. And yes, we do find on the Isle that moose get stuck together sometimes. So in one of the visitor centers, they had these two male moose skulls that had been trapped together. The team one earlier this year did find a set of males that were locked together as well. Whenever I see this and I think about this, it's hard not to imagine what those last days must have been like, how miserable it was for both of these moose, not being able to eat or drink and having to stay locked with the one organism you hate the most. I mean, this is so awful for these individual moose. So every year, the moose are going to grow those huge antlers. They're going to invest the energy into making those structures. And after the breeding season, they get to release those antlers, and it's got to feel amazing to shed all of that weight. Our Moose Watch team was able to find this double shed. It's unusual to find both of the antlers at the same time. So Garrett, one of our team members, tried on the double moose shed to help give you a sense of how big those are. Garrett's a pretty tall guy. And while this is a very hilarious video, in the background, I want you to focus on the woods. Imagine trying to walk through the woods with those antlers and trying to maneuver through that very dense vegetation. It's got to be such a relief to release those antlers and shed them at the end of the breeding season. So this video, if you haven't seen it, is drone footage. And it's really remarkable that somebody was able to catch the moment that this moose shed its antlers. I had seen this video before we found the double shed in the woods. And so for the rest of the day, that's all I could imagine was that shake and the moose that must have shook those antlers out. Now, as much as I love moose, they do wreak havoc on the balsam fir trees. So this is what a balsam fir tree is supposed to look like. But unfortunately, this is the preferred food for moose. And moose will preferentially chew on the balsam fir trees throughout the winter. So here's our balsam fir tree and what it's supposed to look like. But most of the fir trees at the Isle Royale look like this. They're stunted. They are chewed to almost below my waist height. Now, if a balsam fir tree is lucky enough to escape the moose chew and grow beyond the height that a moose can stretch, they often end up as a moose rub as the moose are trying to get all of the velvet off of their antlers towards the breeding season. Many of you may be familiar with this iconic moose. This is Morty from the Northern Exposure series, at least the beginning. And Morty and his sister were orphaned moose that were taken in by researchers at the University of Washington. Unfortunately, they didn't live very long, and part of the reason for that was because of micronutrient deficiencies. It turns out cobalt and copper are two things that moose desperately need, and those are two things that are kind of hard to get in your moose feed or from the environment. While we were out doing our Moose Watch expedition, we stopped by a moose lick. And so moose lick is a soggy area where minerals are accumulating. We were hoping to catch lots of moose here at the moose lick, but unfortunately for us, no moose were visiting that day. Researchers have been going back to the moose licks, not just because of the amount of moose that will congregate there, but also to look in and study some of the mineral composition, getting a better understanding of some of the needs a moose may have. So before we talk about how moose are the diet for wolves, let's look at one more issue our moose may face, and that's the issue of ticks. A moose can have upwards of 80 to 100,000 ticks on their body. Every time I think about this, I can't help but think about all of the tick legs wiggling and moving. I can see the reaction. Oh, yeah, I'm sorry about all of that. But I want you to viscerally feel how miserable these poor moose are. Because what moose will do when they have this many ticks is they will start to rub. And when they're rubbing and rubbing, trying to get rid of the ticks, they're not spending time eating. A moose has to consume 40 pounds of food a day. It has to then re-chew all of that food. And so not being able to spend the time foraging and consuming food starts to decrease their fitness. And then all of that rubbing starts to remove some of the fur. And here we see a moose, a cow moose that has significant fur loss through the neck and shoulders. Imagine going into the winter, less meat on your bones, less fur on your body. This is a very unfortunate situation for the moose, but it's a really good situation for the wolves. So let's talk a little bit about wolf biology. Wolves can get about 60 to 80 pounds. They can live for about 6 to 13 years. If they happen to get a big prey animal like a moose, they can eat about 20 pounds of food in one session. In between getting large prey species, they will eat the snowshoe hare and they'll eat the beaver. Wolves are omnivores. My first trip to the Isle Royale, the National Park Service came across to the Daisy Farm campground and they were talking to the visitors there and they were telling us about how the researchers had observed the wolves come down to the campground one fall and start consuming and eating all of the apples. And I just love thinking about how wolves are out there eating snowshoe hare and moose and apples. I mean, it's kind of like a Thanksgiving dinner when you start to think about it. Wolves will breed in spring. They can have about 4 to 6 pups per litter. In this photo is a female from the Isle with 2 of her pups. The pups will disperse from their pack after about a year if they want to. At the Isle Royale, the most amount of wolf packs that have been observed on the island is 4 separate wolf packs. Now, part of the problem with being a researcher And having the situation of 4 separate wolf packs is the idea that wolf packs have arguments. And it is heartbreaking to watch the fights. And as many researchers have seen, watch the wolves even attack lone wolves. It is not a pretty sight. So I wanted to share this observation. This is from the Wendigo Visitor Center. This is a male 421, and it's a very unusual situation because this is a lone wolf. This wolf had a radio collar, so they had really good observation data. Down in the bottom right-hand side, we've got those observation points shown on the map. As a lone wolf living without companionship or pack support, his existence would likely have been difficult and perhaps lonely. Throughout the summer of 1990, this old wolf slowly declined in health and eventually died of malnutrition as his body was weak and his teeth were worn and damaged. As an active lone wolf, he traveled the entire island, killing moose by himself, but his dinners were often stolen by the packs of wolves. He died just outside a den he frequently used, which was located along the Wendigo Nature Trail. Researchers found him a few days after his death when they arrived in January for their annual winter study. So this is a beautiful example and a case study of the observations that can be made of these wolf populations and just the amazing research that's been done at the Isle Royale. Here we have a compilation of photos that have been taken of the wolves over the years. In the bottom left, you can see one of those radio collars on the wolves. The radio collars have given a lot of really good data and helped people to understand wolf relationship, especially the fights and the arguments between the packs. More recently, researchers have been able to get a hold of genetic analysis, so they now have the DNA of all of the wolves on the island, and they can do a genetic analysis. And as we'll see in a little bit, they have even been able to use GPS collars and get even better data and tracking of wolves at the island. So let's take a look at some of the data that's been gathered about the wolves over time. In this graph, we have the data showing from 1959 all the way through 2018. Yes, they have been continuing to collect data, but I really like this graph because I think it clearly shows us the relationship between the wolf and the moose. So I want to focus on the yellow line. In the 1940s, 2 wolves came to the island. The 2 wolves started to grow the population. And so we can see, we can see here by almost 1980, the wolf population has grown to about 50 individual wolves. In the 1980s, canine parvovirus had been moving across the mainland of the United States. And what we are seeing here represented in this graph is the huge decline as the parvovirus was introduced to the wolves at the island, and very quickly and very brutally decreased that population from 50 down to 14 wolves. We can see that the population oscillates over time, staying relatively stable. Let's jump ahead over here to about 2010. See how that wolf population starts to decline? By 2018, only 2 wolves remained at the island. Now, one of the things you may be thinking, if we started with 2 wolves and went to 50 in several decades, a lot of inbreeding? You are correct. There was a significant amount of inbreeding, and then we had the canine parvovirus, which decreased the population again, which led to another decrease in genetic variation in the population. One of the things researchers noticed in the wolves, because of the decreased genetic variation and because of the inbreeding, is that they had a C7, cervical 7, malformed vertebrae. So that's what we see here on the right. On the left is what the vertebrae should look like. Now, those of you who are anatomy and physiology people, I know what you're doing. I know you're looking at that malformed vertebrae and you're wondering how the muscles are attaching, how that might have affected the wolf, and whether it might have been affecting the wolf's fitness. And you are correct to be asking those kinds of questions. However, there is an unusual observation that happened in 1997. In 1997, the male shown here in the middle came across the ice bridge and started to mate with came across the ice bridge, joined with the middle pack, and started to mate with individuals. Now that's interesting in the sense of new male comes in, starts mating with a pack, So that's new genes. We get this influx of genetic variation. But that's not the most interesting part of the story. The most interesting part of the story is that within 10 years, we lose genetic variation. Almost all of the wolves on the island had his genes. So you can imagine we've got this decrease in genetic variation. We've got some physiological problems that are starting to show up. By 2018, we just have those two wolves. In this upper right-hand photo, we see the two remaining wolves. One was a male and one was a female. In the flyover observations, they saw this kind of aggressive behavior. They think that maybe the male was trying to mate and the female was fighting him off. She absolutely would not receive him. You can imagine the researchers' dismay at noticing this. They're stuck with this decision. Do we allow the wolves to disappear from the island? Or do we do a reintroduction program? Do we find wolves to bring to the island and keep the population alive? So they made the hard decision to bring and relocate wolves to the island. They started this program in the fall of 2018. Now, one of the things that we're very conscientious of is making sure to get wolves from multiple different areas to make sure that they could get the most amount of genetic variation. I do love that all the wolves were given radio collars with GPS. In this bottom right-hand picture, we're seeing the track for wolf number 3. She hung around the island for a while, and then there was enough of an ice bridge. She relocated herself back to Canada and did not decide to stay at the Isle Royale. Now, this decision to relocate wolves was very, very challenging, but remember the larger ecosystem and remember how much moose love to eat balsam fir. So now we can take a look at this graph, and now we can focus on the orange line. We can take a look at the moose population. So if we take a look at the moose population, let's start where our wolf population crashed in the 1980s. As soon as that wolf population crashes, look at what starts to happen to our moose. The moose population takes off. By 1995, there are 2,400 moose living on this island, 45 miles long, 9 miles wide. You can imagine what the balsam fir we're feeling at this moment. The winter of 95 to 96 was incredibly brutal. It was one of the harshest winters that the island had experienced. And so this big drop off is the starvation and the death that ensued after that really harsh winter. Our moose population takes a while to recover, but look what happens in around 2010 as our wolf population starts to decline, that moose population is starting to take off again. So when we look at that graph and we look at that moose population starting to grow, of course researchers were faced with the idea that if we want to save the Isle Royale ecosystem, if we don't want to see this entire place shift, we're going to have to bring the wolves back. Now, how do researchers find out a lot of this data? A lot of this data about the amount of wolves and the amount of moose that are on the island? Well, they do the flyover observations in the winter, counting the moose and wolves when the vegetation is off the trees and it's easier to see the animals. And then they rely on volunteers who love to take a vacation where they don't have a shower and they love to look for moose bones. So I'd like to introduce you to the Team 2 Moose Watch Expedition. We have Ken, Dave, Cindy, Garrett, and shown off in the distance is Lynn Ann Vesper. These are your Moose Watch Team 2 volunteers that went out stomping around in the island in May. None of us knew each other before we had started this Moose Watch expedition. Now, if you want to find moose bones, you have to go where the moose bones will be. So you have to go off trail and you have to make camp whenever you get tired. When we are looking for moose bones, we try to line up as best we can. One person holds a GPS and keeps us on a relatively straight course. We stay about 30 feet from each other, and we're scanning the ground, looking for moose bones, looking for moose bones. I want to give you a sense of how challenging this can be on those rugged ridges and on the island. So Garrett's at the top of this ridge and he's taking the photo. Here's Ken. He's midway down the ridge. And you don't see the rest of us because we're all spread in a line trying to make it through that forest, stumbling over fallen trees and trying to make it through the brush. And we don't let anything get in our way. Here we're crossing a beaver pond, and at the other side of the beaver pond, no matter how mucky it is, we'll spread out and continue to move through the forest searching for moose bones. But one of the things that starts to happen very quickly when you're walking through the forest quietly is you start to think like a moose. You start to feel like a moose. You start to wish you had long legs like a moose. And you realize everybody disappears. So Cindy, shown here in this picture, had been on a moose watch expedition before. And I so appreciated her neon green because it stood out in the woods when everybody else disappeared. Right about the time everybody disappears and you start to wonder if you're ever going to make it out of there alive, you start the game of Marco Polo to try and figure out where everybody's at and make sure that we're all still together. We did have to cross a swollen river in order to keep following our trails and searching for moose bones. One of the things you have to keep in mind about the Isle, it gets several feet of snow every winter. Moose die on top of the snow. And in the spring, as the snow starts to melt, the moose bones will start to melt into the vegetation. Garrett here is rescuing a moose jawbone from the muck of a beaver pond. So you have to be willing, if you're doing this Moose Watch volunteering, to get yourself into some pretty interesting situations. One of the other things we look for in addition to moose bones is we look for the antlers that are shed. Whenever we find an antler, we take some measurements and then we put the X on the antler to communicate to future Moose Watch teams. This antler has been recorded and we know the data about this antler. So here it is, our first set of moose bones that we found. Ken found our first set of moose bones in a cedar swamp, and we can see the skunk cabbage growing here from our first set of moose bones. I love this photo of Dave and the moose skull. He almost tripped over this. And I wanted to share this with you because it helps to show how much the moose bones blend in and how easy it is to mistake a moose bone for a stick. One of the things that drove us all bonkers was you'd look out in the distance and there would be something white. And you're so tempted to start walking towards you. You're like, yes, moose bones. Oh, this is gonna be great. It's gonna be a skeleton. And as you get closer, it's a birch twig. So many birch twigs. It was really, really frustrating. If you do find a skeleton, everybody gets together. You try to find as many bones as possible, and you immediately start to record some data. We record the GPS coordinates where the skeleton was found, and we start to record some of the information about the environment. What kind of trees? Were we in a cedar swamp? We record whether or not the bones have some arthritis, and I'll talk about that just a little bit more. And we start to assess some of the bone characteristics. And when you look at these different characteristics here, understand that this is going to help us to correlate the age of the moose. Things like cracking, how buried it is. The more buried it is, the older it is. So this data is really helpful to coordinate age of moose. On the back side of that data card is where we record the amount of bones that we find and then other characteristics about the skeleton that we might have found in the field. So here we have the team. We've collected, we found a moose skeleton and we've collected those bones, and now we can more easily start to identify the types of bones and fill out the rest of that data card. Now I wanted to show you this picture of a moose. I know it's a little challenging to see if you're not accustomed to picking out bones from the duff. We have the vertebral column here at the top. We have a forelimb coming off to the right, and we have a hind limb coming off to the back. And once you start to see moose skeletons, it's hard not to imagine their last moments. And I couldn't capture in this photo where this moose was found. On three sides of this moose is a lovely sort of cedar grove. I mean, it's like an almost perfect rectangle. And the way how this moose is laid out, with all the bones attached, it's almost like the moose laid down, gave one last stretch, and was done. You don't often find that if a moose has been killed by wolves or there's been other situations, the moose was running. This was just a very peaceful, peaceful skeleton. At the Wendigo Visitor Center, they have a complete moose skeleton. And I loved seeing this because when you're in the field, you almost never get to see every single moose bone. You almost never get to see all the skeleton together. Now, unfortunately, I couldn't capture in this picture how slender and thin they are. So if you look from the front and you see a moose dead on, they're so slender. Their shoulder blades have been pulled in, so their shoulder blades are along the side of their rib cage. And look at how that humerus interacts with the shoulder blade. It interacts in a vertical way. This is not how our bodies are made. This is not like how humans move. All of this is about making this animal slender, thin, to get through those really dense woods and to be able to help them up and around all of the vegetation. Now, we did have a diagram of a moose skeleton to take with us as we were out in the woods. This was helpful for identifying bones. So here's our shoulder blade and our humerus. We have a radius and ulna. And then the last part of the leg is this elongated metacarpal. And if you imagine your hand, take one of those bones and stretch the pad of your hand out. That's the metacarpal. And then they're walking on their little phalanges, their little fingertips. If we take a look at their rear leg, they have a femur like we do. They have a tibia. And then this long back part of the leg is essentially their foot. So over here, the calcaneum is their heel. And then imagine stretching the length of your foot out. And that's the majority of your leg. And there's their little phalanges, their little tippy toes that they're walking on. So I wanted to show you that image after talking about how skinny and slender they are so you would have a better understanding of how they're so capable to move around in the forested environment. When we found bones, we would take specific bones. We would take a skull, a couple of mandibles. If there was a metatarsal, one of those leg bones, we would take one of those. The metatarsal is helpful for calculating the size and potentially the age of the moose. We were always hoping for incisors, teeth that help to age the moose. And so here we see on the back of my pack a package of bones from one of our skeletons to take back to the researchers. Here's a picture of the moose vertebrae. I want to focus in on the thoracic vertebrae. If you look at the height of those projections, the height of those processes, this is where all the muscles from the neck are going to connect. This is where the muscles that hold up those huge antlers and that huge head, this is where they're all connecting, which is why those bones are so tall. And this is also what's going to give the moose the characteristic bump on their back. Now I wanted to show you this image because it looks like if you have these bones laying down in the duff around you, it should be pretty easy to put them together, right? This should be a really quick puzzle. It is not. The amount of time trying to figure out what each of these bones are and how they all fit together was very, very challenging. So here you see a successful moose puzzle put together so we could identify all of those bones. I wanted to share with you some of the special moose that we found on our adventures. This is moose number 9. Moose number 9 was an almost complete intact skeleton. It was also a recent wolf kill. On the right-hand side, we have one of the legs, and it was such a recent wolf kill that the connective tissue was still intact. And so we were able to put that leg together. On the left-hand side, you can see the vertebral column and the skull. It was very helpful to find all of these moose bones. This is the rest of that vertebral column from moose number 9. And I'm not showing it to you because the vertebral column is all intact. That was very helpful and wonderful. But remember all of those bumps and processes? They're all gone. So one of the things that happens with a wolf kill is the wolves will start to chew on the bones later. And what we were finding is that they often chew off all of those processes on the tops of the vertebrae. So that was really a wonderful find, moose number 9. On the left-hand side, we have a moose that Dave had found, and the antlers were originally attached. Whenever you find a moose skull with antlers attached, you're supposed to bring the entire thing back to the researchers. But unfortunately, this moose was so old, the antlers came unattached. So it was still a unique find to find both of the antlers attached to the moose's skull. But unfortunately, those antlers came off because of the age of the moose. It had been in the ground for a very long time. So I wanted to give you a close-up of what a moose skull looks like. And one of the things that's really fascinating is to see how the moose have plates, and those plates fuse together similar like the plates on a human skull, and we can see where that fusing happens on the skull. We were walking along one day, and it was kind of earlier on in the day. We were spread out across a ridge. Cindy was really high up on the ridge, and as she was walking, all of a sudden she called out, "Bones!" That's what you do when you find the bones. You call out, and then everybody starts to come to you, and we start to analyze the site and start identifying bones and collect our data. So I start walking towards her. I'm walking up this ridge, and I look over my right shoulder, and just as I look over my right shoulder, I see stretched across the rocks, bones! So this was a wonderful find, moose number 12. As you would imagine, recent death. Turns out that this moose was killed by wolves. The reason why we know that is because there's just one leg. One of the things that happens when wolves kill a moose is they divide up the legs. They'll tear the legs off and they'll take them off very far away and enjoy their leg in privacy away from the rest of the pack. Unfortunately, we did not find the other 3 legs. We searched for so long and we went so far away from this moose, we never found the other legs. It was incredibly frustrating. But we were glad we had this one leg and that the moose was kind of fresh. So one of the macabre things that we need to do whenever we find a fresher kill is we need to cut into the bones. We need to see the marrow. If a moose has been starving, when you cut open the bone will be hollow. There won't be any marrow inside. If the moose was well fed, you expect to see some marrow on the inside. Now I'm going to spare you the video of the cutting of the bone to see if there was marrow and just tell you there wasn't. This poor cow moose most likely was starving upon her death. Now associated with this, we also found lots of organs spread throughout the ridge, and we found a mostly intact stomach with the stomach contents as well. Also near this moose was some wolf fecal matter, and this was really exciting. I collected that fecal matter, and I'm hoping that there was enough DNA. Remember I was talking earlier, genetic analysis. So if that DNA was intact, they can compare it to the other DNA samples and figure out who was there, which wolves, which pack might have been consuming this moose. So I'm really was excited about moose number 12. On the left-hand side, we see a moose with a mostly intact vertebral column. Whenever we would find bones, we would start to pile them up together. This was the sign to future Moose Watch expeditions that this site had already been found and we'd already collected all of the data. We almost tripped over moose number 13, nestled into the soil. Moose number 13 was very large. You can start to see the size of the skull here. Both of the antlers were still attached. When we got to digging out more of the bones, because of the size of the bones, because of how deeply it was buried in, we started to suspect that moose 13 was one of the 96ers. 96ers are what we use to refer to those moose that might have died in the big event, that harsh winter in 1996. This is the axis vertebrae. I want to give you a sense of how large that is. So that one vertebrae takes up my entire hand. One of the things that we would do as in our team is we would name our moose. We would name our moose in alphabetical order. And yes, I know this is moose 13. I want to remind you, we retired We've been sleeping out in the woods for several days. This was kind of later in the day. And so we named this one Larry. So this is Larry the Moose. Larry the Moose was pretty interesting. So we took the skull with the attached antlers back, and Garrett was the one to offer to haul this very, very heavy moose and antlers back to the research site. I was mentioning earlier that we like to collect incisor teeth. And one of the reasons why we love the incisor teeth is because you can cut them in half and you can count the rings. And the rings will help to tell you how old the moose is. Now, this skull was really an interesting skull. The reason why we like this skull is because when we look at the top row of teeth here, we can see some of the thinning bone. That thinning bone is periodontal disease. So when we're looking at the moose skulls, yes, we're figuring moose bones, we're figuring out which ones are which, but then we also start to look for some of those refined characteristics. In this case, did this moose have periodontal disease? We also start to look for osteoarthritis. If you're not familiar with the hip bone, this is a moose hip bone, and this indentation, this kind of rounded areas where the femur interacts with the hip bone. The ligament would come through this hole, and lucky for this moose, we have pretty nice open acetabular fossas. I said that for all the anatomy and physiology people. So we don't have a lot of osteoarthritis in this moose. Yay for this moose, not needing any Advil. But this poor moose, we start to see the filling in of that space. This would have been pretty painful for that moose. And then when we take a look at this poor moose, look at how filled in that space is. This moose would have had severe osteoarthritis, and sometimes the osteoarthritis gets so bad that they end up with femur dislocation. Now, the reason why I wanted to share this with you is sometimes we look at research about animals, especially predator-prey, or looking at just the research of the moose, and it's harder to understand the larger context. When it comes to the research about the moose, we have such a large data set. We have such a consistent data set that goes for such a long period of time. The researchers are starting to see these larger patterns. Some of the recent research that Dr. Sarah Hoy and her colleagues have published is they started looking at this correlation between periodontal disease and the development of osteoporosis and osteoarthritis. So these types of correlations and these types of connections that are being made with the moose could help to inform how we treat and deal with osteoporosis and osteoarthritis in humans and other populations. Notice that this journal, this research was published in the Journal of Osteoarthritis and Cartilage. That's a journal for people. So I love the fact that the research has farther ramifications beyond just ecology. When we can see these larger scale patterns, we can start to understand more about ourselves and potentially come up with solutions to problems. So here we see moose number 15. This was our last official moose skeleton that we found. It was towards the end of the day. It was towards the end of our trip. We still had about 3 miles to go before we would reach the path and reach our campsite. We were tired. We were tired. We all just wanted to get back, set up camp, have our dinner, crawl into our sleeping bags. We quickly, and I do mean quickly, collected the data on this moose, and we kept on moving, and it didn't take much longer. The front person at the head of the line, we all went, no, nope, nope, nope. We only had 15 data cards. We can't do this. We can't do this. We put GPS coordinate on it so that the next Moose Watch team can come and be very, very successful. So officially we only have 15, but yes, we found more. They just wouldn't stop coming. Our original mission, we were originally sent out into the field to revisit past moose finds. Yes, they had collected all of the data, but Rolf had sent us out to specifically look for the sacral vertebrae, the sacrum, and that last lumbar vertebrae that interacts with the sacrum. So here we see a picture of what Rolf wanted us to look for. He wanted us to look for asymmetry in those last vertebrae. They had started observing these asymmetrical vertebrae in the moose, and he wanted us to go and find them. The reason why they're so interested in these is because they already had seen evidence of asymmetrical vertebrae in the wolf population. And remember that asymmetrical vertebrae in the wolf population is most likely due to inbreeding and decreased genetic variation. So if we're starting to see this in the moose population, the logical question is, are the moose now starting to experience a high level of inbreeding and a decrease in genetic variation? So I love the fact that after all these decades, all these years, there are still so many new questions and so many new things that we can ask about the moose and the wolves at the Isle Royale. So here's a summary of our data from the Team 2 Wolf Moose Expedition. Our total on-trail miles were 18. Those were easy miles. Our total off-trail miles were 27. Here we see the map of the western portion of the Isle Royale. All of these red lines are where the other teams had previously been. So this is Team 1 and Team 2 from May of this year. This was our route. Just our team covered all of this land looking for moose bones. So I hope you have a better understanding of the importance of the research being done at the Isle Royale and this relationship between moose and wolves. I'd like to briefly talk just a little bit about the future. Things, as many of us are keenly aware of, are changing. The winters are so much warmer. The ice bridge doesn't form as often. This last winter was really, really warm. The winter flyover study had brought the plane out. They land in Washington Harbor by Wendigo at the western side. And unfortunately, within a few days, the temperatures rose and the ice started to thin. And the ice was thinning so quickly, they scrambled to get the plane pulled up on land. Everybody was very nervous. They had to abandon the winter study. The ice the temperatures did drop and the ice thickened up just enough to get the plane out of there. The plane goes back to the mainland in Grand Marais in Minnesota, but they couldn't continue the research. They couldn't do a flyover. For the first time in 60 years, they could not do the flyover counts. So our best estimate of wolves from last winter is that there were 30 wolves on the island and about 840 moose. Now, regardless of how we might feel about things, the island is old. The volcanic rock and the living things that have been grappling with survival on those rocks have been engaged in relationships for years. Whatever the next chapters for this unique island may hold, I know there are lots of us hoping to be a part of it. I want to acknowledge the researchers that have put so much time and effort in and have given us the wonderful information that we know about the island. I want to acknowledge not only my Project Moose Watch team members, but also all of the past Moose Watch volunteers.